afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Paddy Tillett, immediate past president of the club. You thought you'd seen the last of me, but some people just don't know when to leave. Your new president, Susan Kelly, will be back with you next week. Today we focus on the subject of maritime commerce in Oregon and the economic realities behind it. Our speakers are Ogden Beeman, retired president of Ogden Beeman Associates and longtime member of the City Club, and sharing the podium with him is Paul Bingham, who is principal with DRI-WEFA in Washington, D.C., and I'll make proper introductions of both later on. Join us next Friday, the 21st of June, for an enlightening program of the pros and cons of our initiative process, featuring two City Club members, Lloyd Marbett of the Oregon Conservancy Foundation and Steve Novick, former director of the Center for Constructive Citizen Action. Introducing the two sides of the issue will be Dan Meek and Jeannie Berg, and that'll be here at the MAC. Club members, your weekly bulletin can reach you more swiftly and at less expense to the club by email. Let our staff have your email address if you'd like to take advantage of that. You can also make luncheon program reservations online, and you can access our huge library of information at www.pdxcityclub.org. Video and audio tapes of this and any other City Club program are available through the club office. Video tapes are $20 and audio tapes are $10. Call Suzanne at the office for details. Before we begin today's program, we have an update on our sister city club, now officially named the Civic Club of the Ukraine. Wade Fickler, Peace Corps volunteer who worked with the people of Ukraine to establish the organization, spoke to us twice before, I believe, giving us an update, and he's here today to give us another. So, Wade?
Thank you, Patty. When I last addressed this audience, I was a Peace Corps volunteer trying to find my place in Ukrainian society. Ironically, today I'm a returned Peace Corps volunteer trying to find my place in my hometown of Portland, Oregon, USA. As you know, City Club has a sister club in Vinnytsia, Ukraine. I first introduced the City Club concept in January of 2001. Since that time, everything from the name of the organization to its structure, the types of issues it would address, and the way we would do that have been discussed and debated, sometimes agreed upon and sometimes simply abandoned. That seems to be the nature of community development. Nonetheless, City Club inches closer and closer to its goal of being a viable and useful resource for the citizens of Vinnytsia. March 30th of this year was Election Day in Ukraine. All seats in the parliament, as well as local and regional governments, were on the ballot. Everything except the presidency was up for grabs. This was an important election for Ukraine. It was its 10th year since independence, and many political observers believe this would be the election that would determine Ukraine's commitment to democracy. Civic Club was a visible and active participant in the electoral process. In preparation for the election, Civic Club hosted 4 mayoral debates. These were the first open political debates in the city, and they garnered considerable media attention and drew large audiences. By creating a new mechanism that allowed credible information to surface and encouraged civic action by citizens, Civic Club provided a truly valuable resource to the community. In addition to the mayoral debates, the Podilsky Center, which is our parent organization in Vinnytsia, hosted 4 voter education forums in rural areas of the oblast. During each of these forums, we conducted many polls to gauge the audience members' attitudes towards civic responsibility. In all cases, over 90% of those responding indicated that it was the government's responsibility to solve problems in their local communities. And sadly, only 1% of those responding believed that citizens had a role in solving their local issues. We saw this as a clear sign that the Soviet mentality of a passive citizenry must be overcome, and Civic Club of Vinnytsia will continue to be a catalyst for this change. With the success of the debates behind us now, the club shows even more signs of sustainability. As one of my colleagues said, the idea has a right to live. When I left Vinnytsia in April, Civic Club Director Andriy Tatarin and Podilsky Center Director Mikhailo Bordin were considering several new projects that would address the health, education, housing, and political issues of the community. Civic Club of Venus is proud to be associated with City Club of Portland and would like to strengthen ties between the club and between individual members. If you'd like more information on how you can be involved, please contact the City Club office. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wade. Our board host seated at the far end of the table is Gwen Milius, member of the Board of Governors and Marketing Coordinator for WPH Architecture. She will have the privilege of asking the first question of our speakers today. Following Gwen's question, we'll open the program to questions from City Club members in the audience. Please don't be shy about getting to the microphone ahead of time so that we make the most of our speakers' time. Identify yourself as a member of the City Club and ask your question as concisely as you can. Broadcast of City Club programs this quarter is made possible in part by corporate underwriting from Kaiser Permanente, from Wells Fargo Bank, and from Zimmer Gunsel Frasca Partnership. We are very grateful for their support. Paul Bingham is a principal with DRI-WEFA, where he manages the Global Trade and Transportation Group's consulting work. He's an economist who has managed a number of major studies in commodity flows during the last 18 years. Among them was an economic analysis and forecast of maritime trade and its inland movements in Washington state, so he's no stranger to the Pacific Northwest. He's also conducted similar studies for MDOT, the Mississippi Department of Transportation, for railroad companies, for SCAG, which is the Southern California Association of Governments, and for the FHA, which is the Federal Highway Administration. Acronyms have a way of making perfectly straightforward things sound horribly cryptic, and I'm hoping that he will decipher DRI-WEFA for us later. Mr. Bingham is a Bachelor of Arts in Economics from Cornell and a Bachelor of Science in Economics and Computer Applications from the University of Maryland. He chairs the Freight Transport Data Committee of the National Academy of Sciences Transportation Research Board and is active on 3 other of their committees. Sharing the podium with Mr. Bingham today is longtime City Club member and former president Ogden Beeman. Many of you know Ogden and are aware of his impressive career, but for the benefit of any who do not know him, I'll recite a few highlights. Ogden followed a BS in civil engineering at Stanford with a spell in Holland, where he received a diploma in hydraulic engineering from the Technical University at Delft. I've had the good fortune to work with Ogden professionally and know that he likes to go directly to the best source. So it's no surprise that he went off to Holland to find out about hydraulic engineering. As a young engineer, he joined the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, later becoming chief of the Waterways Maintenance Branch, and among other things, he was directly involved in an earlier channel deepening operation in the Columbia. After leaving the Corps, he joined the Port of Portland, serving as Marine Director from 1972 to 74. The following 2 years, he spent in Korea directing the design of 21 commercial and industrial ports. Since 1976, Ogden has directed his own consulting firm, based here in Portland, and practicing all over the world. He's completed over 500 assignments in 20 countries and is currently working on the Panama Canal. He has a long list of publications, including works on ship canal design, dredging, protective land use strategies, port design, and so on. And there's also a lengthy catalogue of professional affiliations and honors, but rather than recite them, I'll yield the podium to him. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome former City Club President Ogden Beeman.
Thank you very much. The bulletin for this week caught up with me in London on Monday, and I first read it and read my title, Retired, from a job I retired from 35 years ago. Adding that to my age, I thought, how many people are going to come out to listen to a 100-year-old man? And then my second thought was, well, maybe they realize I actually was only 32 when I retired 35 years ago, and probably conforming to the fantasy of many of my friends, I really haven't worked for the last 35 years. There are 54 million people in the United States. 53,960,000 of them have no interest in Portland becoming a seaport. The speaker, Major Alfred Sears, the year 1883, the head of navigation, St. Helens, Oregon, the depth of the Columbia River, 15 feet. 8 years later, the Port of Portland was created by the state legislature. Its sole and only purpose to provide a channel to the Pacific Ocean. It's not surprising that it was not authorized at that time to do airports, since I think this may precede the Wright brothers and the advent of flight. Portland is a port today because of citizen support and effort over the ensuing 110 years. This leadership has varied. Sometimes it's been mayors, sometimes governors, sometimes representatives and senators. It has always been bi-state, Oregon and Washington as its basis, because of the equal interest in the channel, a subject I'll speak about in a few minutes. I like to use ship channels as bridges as a metaphor. A bridge to Asia, yes, we all understand that about the Columbia River. But think of this, a bridge uniting Oregon and Washington interests, in uniting urban and rural interests in the state of Oregon, and north-south interests also in our state. How many of you know that the counties with the major benefits from Portland's container service are Marion, Multnomah, Lane, and Umatilla in that order? Marion County, the greatest beneficiary county in Oregon for our ship channel. The river channel promotes international trade due to access. It provides access to overseas markets. Some examples of this were never anticipated in earlier studies. When field burning was closed down and there was nothing to do with the straw, the farmers found a way to harvest that straw and send it to Japan. Why? Because shipping facilities were available at the upper end of the Willamette Valley. Scrap metal and paper for recycling. These exports are major exports from the Port of Portland. Again, never anticipated in early studies, but very, very important from an environmental standpoint and recycling standpoint for the excess or recycled commodities in our state. What is the result of this 110 years of citizen support for our channel? The channel now carries 40 million tons of commerce with 2,000 ship calls a year, certainly rating it among the major U.S. port systems. Interestingly enough, 1/2 of these commodities flow through Washington ports and 1/2 through Oregon ports, a ratio that has changed somewhat dramatically in the last 20 years as Washington ports have taken advantage of their land holdings and strategic position. There are, of course, major channel-dependent industrial development in Portland, Vancouver, Kalama, Longview, and most recently in Rainier, Oregon. However, every 4 days, a ship exceeding the 40-foot channel design standards moves on the river channel every 4 days. And actually, that's down a little bit in the last couple of years when there were perhaps 100 to 150 ships moving in that situation. These ships carry corn, containers, potash, and other commodities which were not forecast when the 40-foot channel was authorized and funded in 1962. Not forecast. The lesson? The channel provides the opportunity for trade. We cannot fully foresee its use in the future. It's there as an opportunity for international trade. I'd like to talk a little bit about the future. Paul's going to do more of that, but I just wanted to say a few words. First of all, I'd like to lead off by quoting from Richard Posner's his book, The Public Intellectual. He said, "People who make forecasts about the future should have their own web page and post these forecasts." He said, in addition, each year they should publish a book of retractions. When I think about the future, I recall being in Honolulu many years ago, actually with colleagues from San Francisco, and we were being interviewed by the Port of Honolulu for a master plan study. And I was in there with my colleagues, and during the question and answer period, one of the people from the Harbors Department said, how are you going to predict the future of, and then he named some commodity or situation for demand of the port? That's a puzzling question, which we had, of course, discussed in our preparation for the meeting. My colleague, Doug Lathrop from San Francisco, said without blinking, we're going to use the Bogsats method, and kind of stared everybody down. I could see these people a little uneasy, but nobody had the courage to ask the critical question. And so we got slipped by that with the Bogsats methodology on the table, and we walked out of the room feeling pretty good about the interview. And I said, Doug, I've been in this business for a while. Never heard of the Bogsats methodology. Could you share it with me? He says, well, of course, Ogden. It's an acronym for a bunch of guys sitting around talking. So that was the methodology we're going to use in that case to predict the future. I want to talk a little bit about kind of some of the elements that I think may interrupt or enhance these 40 years of growth. Since the 40-foot project was started basically in around 1960, cargo tonnage on the Columbia River has quadrupled. In 40 years, it's quadrupled. Not unlike, as I think Paul could tell us, kind of the overall growth of international commerce in the world, which closely parallels the growth of gross national product in the world, which is something between 3 and 4%, which results in a doubling every 20 years. So in these 40 years, I've already mentioned the commodities that were not forecast 40 years ago, but the other ones came along, and we've seen this massive growth. When talking about the future, I like to think about the first law of forecasting. And as some of you know, and I'm sure Paul knows, the first law of forecasting is give them a number or a date, but never both. And we've seen that actually with our nation's approach to terrorism, actually, sadly, in the last couple of months, that we see, yes, an event is projected, but no date for its occurrence. I have 3 things that I'm keeping an eye on about the future of this river and of this channel. Some of them might surprise some of you, even people knowledgeable about this river. The first one is watch the Panama Canal. And it's something, fortunately, that during the next year I'm going to have a chance to do firsthand. I'll be down there for my 3rd trip next month, and I will be deeply involved in the planning for the expansion of the canal. But why should we watch the Panama Canal? Generally speaking, it can be said the growth of West Coast ports over the last couple of decades has been very strongly driven by the constraints on the Panama Canal. Those constraints have been congestion, pricing, and probably more important, the increasing restriction on ships passing through the canal. Without question, the corn trade that started out of the Columbia River in 1985 was very much driven by the constraints on the Panama Canal. And the containers, the intermodal container movements, which have led to a skyrocketing of container trade on the West Coast, generally been caused because of the constraints of the canal. So increasingly, East Coast ports have been served off the West Coast. Sometime in the next 6 to 8 years, a decision on expanding the canal will be made. Sometime perhaps in the next 8 to 12 years, that expansion, if financially feasible, will be done, and the ballgame will change for West Coast ports. No question about it. The second thing to look for, watch European trends in waterway development. Well, now that sounds strange, doesn't it? Why should we in Portland, Oregon, watch European trends? The Europeans are a ways ahead of us in their thinking, as they are on some other subjects. The European Union has increasingly realized that waterborne transportation is not only important economically, it is a major factor in the environmental scene. And the reason for that is, if you put it on the water, it comes off the road. If you put it on the water, the fuel carrying capacity, the capacity to carry cargo per ton of fuel goes up by a factor of about 10. So waterborne commerce, A, is very fuel efficient, and B, for the Europeans, most importantly, it gets trucks and railroads off of their systems and decongests for other more important uses. So I would say, watch the Europeans. They're going to lead the way, and sometime, perhaps in the next decade or so, we will learn the wisdom and quit talking about ignoring our waterway system or destroying our waterway system and start realizing what an important environmental plus it can be for us. They are ahead of us. My third point, watch the rail. Portland has advantages when it comes to railroads. That's the reason the port is here. The water level route coming down the Columbia River, we think of it as for barges. No, it's more important for rail. It's flat water level route and the most efficient rail access from the Midwest to the West Coast. Portland has advantages. These railroads go right through here. We have disadvantages. Many of the cargoes on these railroads are bypassing Portland and going to Puget Sound. Astonishing percentage of Puget Sound cargo bound for Tacoma and Seattle goes right through our very city. We are not the beneficiaries of this. We are paying the penalty of this through increased congestion and all of the problems that go with that, perhaps constraining our own rail capacity and our considerable capacity to grow our own facilities. Interestingly enough, the ports of Long Beach and LA have just spent $1.3 billion, that's B with $1 billion, to improve rail access to their ports. And I might add that about 40% of that, I think, was federal money, and to my knowledge, never preceded by an economic analysis. Right now, the Port of Oakland is working on off-site development, not only outside the Port of Oakland, but outside, in fact, perhaps the state of California. In conclusion, I'd like to just say a few words about my friend and mentor, the late Adam Heinemann. He was one of a handful of people without whom this river channel would not exist as it does today. I said in his eulogy, he was one of a small group who believed that the Columbia River navigation system was created by our forefathers, and it is our public responsibility to preserve and enhance their work on behalf of the future citizens of this region. As I conclude this talk, I ask, who will shoulder this important task? Thank you.
Tough act to follow. I want to thank you all for giving me the opportunity to be here today. First off, let me answer Patty's question. What does the acronym DRI-WEFA stand for? And after I tell you, you'll understand why we use the acronym. The company is a year old, and it's a merger of two previously established forecasting firms. And DRI stood for Data Resources Incorporated, and WEFA stood for Wharton Econometric Forecasting Associates. So if I tried to tell somebody what that whole acronym meant all the time, I wouldn't have time for anything else. So, no, I've been in Portland all week, and this is my last presentation. I've been brought here this week to present the conclusions of a very interesting set of studies. It was two studies in one that we've done for a group of sponsors that together are of like mind and attempt to do planning in a comprehensive context to make decisions better for the region as a whole. This was a study that encompassed not only maritime trade and transport, which I'm going to talk to you about today, but all modes of freight transport, all commodities moving into, through, and passing through the region. The forecast was done and sponsored by Metro, Oregon DOT, the ports of Portland, the Port of Vancouver, and RTC, the Regional Transportation Council over in Clark County. These organizations got together this round to expand a scope of commodity forecasts, of which there have been 2 previous studies in about the past 10 years. These provide long-term forecasts with a common baseline for discussion and planning across all the other dimensions of issues related to freight transport on the system, on the network, and how it interrelates to everything else that's required in planning, whether it's passenger or land use or other issues that face the region as a whole. This set of studies was organized this time so that we did 2 studies in one. The main study from the perspective of the metropolitan area was the all-commodity study with a forecast update of all freight moving just for the metropolitan area of Portland and Vancouver. But at the same time, we did a study of the lower Columbia River system, which includes all the ports all the way out to the ocean. So it's the entire cargo moving on the channel. Excuse me, these 2 studies overlapped, obviously, very significantly in the metropolitan area, but there are some distinctions between the 2 of them in terms of the scope, looking at what moves across the channel. The baseline forecasts were measured in volume and value. We did not attempt to do an economic impact study. We didn't look at jobs, and we didn't look at some other aspects that you might try to do if you were trying to measure some other aspects of freight transport. This study was intended to provide a fundamental forecast of the demand for goods over the next 30 years. This is tied to forecasts of global trade, global economic activity, national economic activity, state economic activity in Washington and Oregon, and forecasts of the metro area, driven by such fundamentals as growth in population, participation in the labor force, industry shifts in terms of where employees will be working and what industries they will be finding jobs in, and also competition between producers and consumers around the world for the movement of freight and goods. The forecasts that we did were driven by production and consumption demand tied to geography for the entire world for international trade and for domestic markets, various levels of geography that were aggregated together to then provide us with forecasts that were commodity specific. There were about 40 commodities that we used in the commodity forecast update, individual categories of goods movement. And on the river system, we looked down at even a finer level of detail for certain types of commodities that move significantly on the channel. And for the maritime cargo, we also looked in detail at some what you would call the submodes. It's the different types of vessels and terminals and characteristics of movements of the goods, the dry bulk separate from the break bulk, or those things that move in containers that Ogden referred to, or the liquid bulk movements. We also looked at the forecast from a perspective of a high and low. We actually tried to bracket forecasts rather than the tradition that we like as economists to do, which is to say, here's what the truth is in the future. Here's the one number that we're going to have. Because of the variability and uncertainty in forecasts from things like exchange rates and forecasts, we tried to bracket and provide a high and a low alternative to give a fairly high confidence interval in which we would expect the tonnage and the value of trade to be in the future on the river system. So what did we find? Well, let me step back and put it in context. Of the entire freight moving in the region, we found that cargo will double in the next 30 years. That means a ton that's moving today somewhere on a truck or a rail car, there'll be 2 of them in 30 years on a transportation network that may not be doubling in capacity. That's really the bottom line for this study, is that's the demand that's there. That's the demand based on growth in income and jobs and employment, what people want to buy and consume, and what producers want to be able to move and sell. There's going to be twice as much in 30 years. And there's nothing really remarkable about that. The growth rate, the compound average annual growth rate, is 2.1%. That's faster than growth in population, but it's not as fast as growth in total output for the region. So actually freight's going to grow slightly slower than we view the value of the economy as a whole. So this isn't remarkable speculative growth by any means. This doubling of freight happens with what we view to be a very solid conservative forecast. Now, within that total growth, there are some great differences as we start to look across the many dimensions of the forecast, including variability by mode of transport. the individual types of commodities, the length of haul or the origin destination, how they move on the route network, and service characteristics. And if we look just at the level of the top modes, we see things that reflect the types of goods that are carried by the individual modes due to the various advantages that they have. The fastest growing mode that we see in tonnage in the forecast period is actually air cargo, off of a very small base, and yet growing at 3.7% per year for each of the next 30 years. The types of goods they take, that they move are the very high value goods such as the semiconductors and electronics that move, that demand to be moved very quickly and can afford the very high cost of air transport. And then we look across the other modes, the next fastest growing is truck, which today carries the largest single tonnage in the area. It is going to grow 2.7% over the forecast period, and we believe that truck tonnage actually is going to grow in line with its role gluing together all of the other modes. A truck is the default by which you get things between a port terminal and a rail, and if anything else breaks down, you move it by truck. Maritime is going to grow slower, but actually the slowest growing is going to be pipeline. And for this study, we actually looked at petroleum product pipelines. There's no refineries in this area. The refined products that come and are consumed here are either produced in Puget Sound or imported up the river system. And the pipeline growth is going to be very slow over this forecast period because nobody's building new ones, and we're not projecting that they're going to over the next 30 years. So let's turn to looking just at the waterborne. What's moving on the river system? The context of what we're talking about today, and Ogden's done a very good job of explaining in general terms the role of the river system. Total overall growth in waterborne tonnage that we forecast is going to average 1.03% per year over the 30 years. That's very slow growth, but it's real growth and it adds to real tonnage increases over the period. That's more vessel calls. It's more handling at the individual terminals and facilities, and it's more revenue to the producers of those goods, whether they be domestic producers here in the U.S. or whether they're the exporters that are serving import markets here in the U.S., meeting the demands of the U.S. consumers. Now, we looked in this study at the request of the sponsors at the issue of the channel deepening. And we attempted to do forecasts and produce forecasts that we think bracket pretty well what can be expected from a deepening of the channel from the existing 40 feet to 43. First of all, we looked at the cargoes that move on vessels that can benefit from sailing drafts of a channel that's 43 feet, over 40 feet that we have today. And in fact, there's only two categories where we see additional cargo that could be foreseen from having a deeper channel. But those are significant. Those two categories are the containerized trades, the very high-value goods that move on the river system, and the grain exports, which are very significant to producers in the U.S. and serving the hinterland of the country. Container traffic that we project under a without versus a with project condition, and that's the arcane language used by the Corps of Engineers to describe the 40-foot versus a 43-foot channel, is subject to some serious constraints, though, and Ogden did a very good job to describe the physical characteristics of the world vessel fleet in terms of how it's growing. And what this translates into that affects what the forecast will be for the Columbia River system is diversion. And by diversion, we mean containers that are produced, or the cargo that is shipped in containers that is produced here or that is demanded to be brought here for consumption of the goods carried in them here, being handled by other ports on the coast. And that's already happening today with a 40-foot channel. There are vessels on the Trans-Pacific trade, which is the most significant one served by the West Coast ports, that draw too much water to come up the channel. Puget Sound has greater channel depth, as does Oakland and San Pedro Bay as we look further south. But primarily the other port system that's serving this market today is Puget Sound, and we forecast that that's going to continue. In fact, if we don't deepen the channel, the percentage of the container trade that will, for this region, the metropolitan Portland-Vancouver region, that will be handled by Puget Sound in 2030 will be 70% of the export TEU boxes. The TEUs are these 20-foot equivalents, the sort of half trailer load size units that the container business uses to measure their trade. And 80% of the imports will come through Puget Sound. So how do they get here from Puget Sound? Well, they're on a railroad or a truck, which costs some more money and maybe has some other implications for the transportation network in terms of capacity and congestion. And when we looked at the forecast of what would happen with the 43-foot channel, we can actually foresee some diversion back into the Columbia River system. We saw Hanjin announce service again today, or this week, and coming back into this market because they know that even though from the perspective of the entire Pacific coast, the level of absolute trade through Portland in the container market is small, it is still a significant one and one that an individual carrier thinks they can still make money on. Our customers in the container business that buy our regularly updated forecasts are always looking for opportunities like that where they think they can have an advantage by putting vessels into a port where they can attract traffic that one of their competitors isn't capturing. And that may be versus one that has a call only in Puget Sound and not in Portland. But what that means is with a 43-foot deepening, there will be vessels that will be of size to use the channel and will carry container traffic such that that forecast in 2030 of 70% of the exports and 80% of the imports being handled through Puget Sound falls to 45% of the exports and 65% of the imports. So even if we deepen the channel to 43 feet, we still have 2/3 of the imports coming through Puget Sound ports. So we're still going to have a tremendous demand on the transportation system, even if we deepen the channel. But the difference in those two is very significant in terms of the total tonnage and the number of actual boxes that would be having to move on the highway or the roadways network. Now, we also looked at what would happen to grain. Today, the markets for grain worldwide are very competitive. There are a number of different countries that are competitive producers that compete with the U.S. The U.S. has suffered in the last few years with a relatively strong dollar exchange rate, meaning that our commodity prices have in local currency terms in foreign markets sometimes have no longer been competitive, and we've lost share of certain markets. And yet, even with that strong dollar, we've still been successful as exporters of some very high volumes of agricultural commodities, such as grains that we're very productive in producing to Asian customers. Now, a lot of that grain today is actually moving out of Puget Sound rather than Portland, even though it's, in many cases, coming right through the Columbia Gorge to actually get up to Puget Sound on a rail car first. And does that make sense? Well, the economics behind it are what determine that decision in the end, and one of the reasons that goes to Puget Sound is you can have larger vessels call and load grain today in Puget Sound than you can get into Portland or Vancouver. There are about 1/3 of the loads today that are loaded in Puget Sound that are in vessels over 60,000 tonnage in terms of the shipment size. And those are large volumes of grains that are going to places like China that would, in the future, be expected to purchase an increasing amount of grain from wherever they can buy it in the world that can be effective and price competitive in producing it. So with a 43-foot channel, actually, you can bring some vessels that are larger into the system and load here in Portland, closer to the producing markets and at a lower cost to the shippers. And even some of the vessels that call today, you could load them deeper and actually put more cargo on them. And the impact of the deepening would allow an additional 5 million tons in 2030 under even our most conservative low forecast scenario, and 6.6 million tons additional loaded out of Portland in 2030 versus a 40-foot channel. But even with a 43-foot channel, there will still be grain going to Puget Sound. So the questions and the conclusion on the river system that come from this are many, and this forecast that we've produced doesn't answer the question and didn't attempt to address whether or not the deepening is justified economically. We didn't look at the cost side of it. We only attempted to look at what's the underlying market demand, and that comes from the foreign consumers and the ones domestically. But doing the analysis in the context of the other transportation modes, we can see the consequences potentially of not being able to move that cargo on the river system. That the demand will still be there and those goods will still need to be moved, but they may need to be carried by some other mode, which may not have the capacity or may not have the competitiveness to be able to move those goods in a way that the U.S. will be able to maintain our export markets, or the imported goods will be able to be moved so efficiently. So the conclusion to take away from this for the planners in the region, and we hope you will address in terms of questions, will be, will the transportation network and the systems that you have today be adequate to handle the demands in the future? Understanding and keeping in mind that the goods will need to be moved to serve the demands for them in the end markets one way or another. And if it's not on the river system, which is, Ogden has said, is the most cost efficient, it will have to be on some other mode. And this doubling of freight is going to happen under conditions that are conservative forecasts. There are potentials that actually those forecasts could be low. And Ogden has given many individual references to how forecasts are done and what the implications of those are. I've been doing forecasting for 20 years and trying to do them frequently and often and update them as much as I can. And yet, we've learned a lot in doing them for 20 years in terms of what you can expect from them. And this is a long-term trend forecast grounded in everything we can learn and understand about existing conditions from the historical data that we have. But there's a lot of things we can't predict, and 9/11 was one example of that, which pulled the world into recession that we hadn't been forecasting. But immediately after 9/11, we were able to take advantage of that data and then actually do a forecast of what the depth and the shape of the recession would be like, and actually do a fairly good job of measuring that. There's similar shocks to these forecasts that could change them, one of which actually would be the results of economic development efforts in the region. And that actually leads to another question, which is there are ongoing efforts within the region to attract new economic activity to the region, bring investment here to create jobs and more opportunity for the local region. But when that happens, I encourage you to think of what are those industries and what types of goods would they require to have moved on the network to meet their needs, and what will they be shipping out of here? We're not forecasting that freight right now on the system, and yet it's very possible. There's great potential for the region to have growth beyond this and extra demands on the system. And with that, I'd like to conclude and say that I've appreciated the opportunity to be here. I hope you pay attention to the study when it's finally released within the next couple of weeks. We're finishing it up the end of this month, and then we hope that it'll be used across the many forums and platforms locally to inform planning to make the right decisions for the future, and to remember that the freight transport that sometimes we all ignore actually plays a very significant part in all of our lives and is very critical to the future well-being and quality of life in the region. Thank you very much.
I was interested in Mr. Beeman's analogy of ship channel as bridge between Oregon communities. In the public eye, the port seems to struggle with the bridge between the environmental movement and industry. Many Oregon industries are researching ways to be more sustainable. Would either of you care to address whether there's more the port could do to build that bridge between the environmental movement and their industries, or is it a simple matter of getting the word out about the existing environmental benefits that the port offers, for example, the recyclable goods movements that you mentioned, and removing shipping from roads and rails?
You go first.
It's a profound question. I guess I would try to stay within something I know about, which is not biology or sustainability, but it is about transportation. I mentioned I'd like to refer back to my comments about the 10T program in Europe. The Europeans have found that the most efficient mode of transport is on water because it's fuel efficient and because it takes vehicles off the highway and reduces congestion. And if there is an easy way to kind of see how this all fits with what we're talking about, I would look to Europe and say, yes, keep promoting your waterway system, get those cars off the road, and increase fuel efficiency by a factor of 10.
I think one of the issues that we address as economists, in the arcane jargon of economists, we call them externalities, but in fact what they are costs that sometimes are not properly quantified. And in the context of doing analysis of what environmental impacts any project or activity in economic terms has, economists try to quantify them in terms of externalities. And I've done some work in that context on some projects, and what that really means is that it is possible, using the tools of even economists, to measure economic impacts in ways that can lead to the proper decisions in terms of sustainability. And that, what I would encourage people to think in context of doing this echoes what I'd said, is thinking across the modes. It's really a holistic picture of the transport system. It's not just trucks on the roadways or just grade crossing interchanges, or even just the river system. It really isn't a comprehensive system where, in the end, the shippers and the carriers and the consumers of goods don't care how something actually got to them as long as it got there on time and it wasn't damaged and it didn't cost them too much to get it there. So we can take advantage of that and use the most efficient modes and the most efficient routing and plan for those so that over time, as a society, we're not wasting resources and we're not causing unnecessary environmental costs on the system by proper selection of and use of the transportation system as a whole.
Don Williams, City Club member. I'd like to ask Ogden Beeman a question. Ogden, there's been a lot of debate since the series in the Oregonian about the channel deepening, and I was surprised, given your reputation and expertise, not only in the region but nationally and in the world, that you weren't quoted in the article. And I was wondering if you could give the audience your opinion about the methodology, and the conclusions that were reached in the article.
Well, since we're not extending the meeting till 5 o'clock tonight, I'll just make a few brief remarks. First of all, I'd like to, I'm reminded of my friend George Sellers, the late George Sellers, who was president of the Washington State Senate and a great promoter of the Columbia River. And he said to me one time, he says, Ogden, he said, don't get in an argument with people who buy ink by the barrel. So, heeding that advice, but trying to be responsive to Don's question, let me answer it factually. Yes, I was interviewed by the Oregonian for 3 hours. Yes, Don's correct. Not one word that I said was quoted in the article, nor was I quoted. And in retrospect, I'm happy that my name was not in any way associated with that. In addition to the 3-hour interview, I would like to say that I offered twice, once after the interview and once right here, actually, after Bill Wyatt's speech, to put on a free tutorial for the Oregonian staff to explain to them how big ships move on this river. It's a rather complex process, and I'm proud to say our firm, in conjunction with the Port of Portland and the Columbia River pilots, developed the LoadMax computerized system that's used to move all large vessels. And it's a complex system, and I thought the reporters should know about it. I was not taken up on my offer. When I read the article in the paper, if you will recall the 7 major items at the top of the article, by observation, I could see that 2 were either partially in error or more than partially in error. I won't say totally in error because, as you recall, the Oregonian never shared either their methodology or their numbers with the readers. So I and many other people who claim expertise in this area are a little puzzled, and it's difficult to, really critique. I did make one phone call, and then that surfaced an error in one of the third of the 7 items that they brought forward. So I guess, Don, that's about as close as I can come to my response. I can't make a more factual response because I and others have not really been exposed to either the methodology that they used or the numerical basis that would allow us to go back and put it together again.
Tom Dunn, member. I guess I have 2 questions. First one, I'll ask them both. One is a door that was opened by Mr. Beeman, and that is more discussion about the Panama Canal possibilities for the 30-year future. What would be sort of the worst case, economic case, impact on West Coast ports? The other question I have is, it does seem to me, from what I read about climate change, that could, in a 30-year period, begin to show a major impact on the amount of water, distribution of water through the seasons that flows down the Columbia River, which then would have impact on how you're going to keep the channel at a given height. So those are my questions.
You want me to go?
Yeah, why don't you go first?
Well, I can claim a little expertise on the first and none on the second, so I'll speak to the first one first. Thank you for hearing my question about the Panama Canal. As I said, a lot of the West Coast port growth taking place in the last 2 decades has because of increasing constraints on the canal. We've begun to look in our assignment down there a little bit at that, and I would pick 2 areas that could substantially affect the West Coast trade. First of all, there are now in the world fleet many, quote, post-Panamax container carriers. That is, they're too wide, not necessarily too deep, but too wide to go through the canal. These post-Panamax carriers are so-called one-ocean carriers, so you see these so-called pendulum services, Asia, LA, back, and then all of that cargo, of course, dropped in LA or sometimes in Seattle, must go to the East Coast by railroad, intermodal movements. When the Panama Canal is, when and if the Panama Canal is widened to accommodate these, we will see a large increase in direct Asia East Coast deliveries for the very reasons I stated, fuel efficiency. And as the price of fuel goes up, it becomes more and more important to keep it on the water. So yes, I would say when that day comes, and it's not going to come overnight, but when that day comes, yes, there will be a reshuffling of container trade on the West Coast. I can only see it to the detriment of the West Coast, but maybe, I'm being too pessimistic. In terms of corn, the feed grains have always moved down the Columbia River the Mississippi River by barge because it's more fuel efficient. And it is only since 1985 that some of those feed grains found their way to the West Coast and kind of gave birth to this spurt of feed grain movements we've had, first off the Columbia River and then off of Puget Sound. If the canal is deepened, undoubtedly, deepened and widened, undoubtedly a lot of those feed grains will shift back to the classical Mississippi River routing, and we could see a decrease in movements of feed grains off of the West Coast. This doesn't affect wheat, it only affects feed grains, corn mainly. On the issue of climate change, I'll pass. I have no expertise in that area.
I'll try to address the first question and then maybe even touch a little bit on the second one in that same context. We've done forecasts for originally the Panama Canal Commission and more recently since the takeover of the Panama Canal Authority for about 15 years. And we've looked at this issue of market demand and how Panama may affect the world, and in fact looked at it from the Panamanian perspective of what are their end markets and where do they serve and who are their competitors. And from their perspective, at least the way I can see it, it's a new day in Panama since the takeover. With the commission running the canal, it was a not-for-profit organization where tolls were set with a simple structure that was well understood and was not to be deemed as a revenue source for actually a profit-making enterprise, and that's changed. Today it's being run as a profit-generating enterprise for the Panamanians. And they are going to pattern themselves after what the Egyptians have done with Suez Canal. They do special rate deals, and they have custom pricing, and they try to price discriminate in terms of attracting certain types of cargo to maximize throughput, and they make investments in their own capacity and infrastructure in an attempt to expand their market. So I fully expect the Panamanians are going to be very innovative in attempting to maximize what goes through their system. Now, whether they're successful or not in being able to justify expansion of the canal, I think is an enormous question, and I'm quite frankly a little doubtful that they're going to be able to justify it, even though we've done forecasts that say there's going to be an enormous demand for goods in the future, which may be able to justify a large revenue stream. I think one of the obstacles for them is the Panama Canal is a freshwater system. So if there's climate change, which is going to in some way shift patterns of rainfall, there's already been in the historical precedents in Panama for having low water years in Panama where they've had draft restrictions on vessels moving through the existing locks, and they could face something similar in the future as they try to expand the watershed to have sufficient fresh water for a hypothetical larger set of locks. One more point on this is that vessel sizes would certainly increase to match an expanded set of locks in the Panama Canal. However, Vessels have a very long life. The vessels that are being launched today that were ordered several years ago are going to be around in 25 years. Typically, the vessels in international cargo service are in use for 25 years. So the shifts happen very gradually. If tomorrow the vessel owners knew that they were going to have a new set of locks with certainty and ordered new vessels, it would take quite a while until the composition of the entire world cargo fleet would reflect that. And that means that change is slow in terms of the sizes and the characteristics, and therefore the vessel call and the routing decisions that the carriers would make for their own operations. Also on the West Coast, I think there's another factor at play is the rail capacity of the U.S. transcontinental rail network. The intermodal freight trains that grew from nothing to be enormously important for the big Class I railroads east to west in the U.S. Have depended on there being at one time excess capacity in the Class I mainline rail network east to west. And as we look at growth in domestic movements of very large volumes of some other goods that the railroads have been successful in being able to attract, such as moving automobiles around in these enclosed auto racks, or for the western railroads, moving enormous volumes of coal from the Powder River Basin east to feed power plants in the east, it may be that they find that their rail capacity may not be something that they want to dedicate as much in terms of a percentage to intermodal rail traffic. So that's another factor that may play in terms of the West Coast being able to compete for cargo that's eventually headed towards the big eastern markets. And another related to this also is the Suez Canal is chasing some of this same traffic. They would like to attract more container ships from Asia serving U.S. East Coast, in which case neither Panama nor the West Coast ports would see that cargo. And other than that, on climate change, I don't know if the low water conditions or the water conditions on average in the Columbia Snake would change. Obviously, that would have an impact on the available sailing drafts and would play right through to how much tonnage you would see on the river system.
John Leeper, City Club member. You, to an extent, sir, Mr. Bingham, alluded to a part of my question, but my question is, you have based all of your forecasts on traffic and the distribution of it, none on the carriers. Is a 43-foot channel for the next 30 years going to be a channel depth that will accommodate it? Because in my general historical reflection, as we have deepened the channel, shortly after the channel depth has been increased or deepened, there has then had to be a follow-on action to turn around and deepen it again. And I just wonder about the ocean carriers and the type, size, and draft of vessels that they may be having on the drawing board. Is 43 feet going to last through 30 years? Or is it possibly 5 years after it's built going to have us addressing again a need for a 45 or a 46-foot depth?
You ask a very excellent question, and in fact, I can guarantee that question will come up at some point in the future, whether or not it's deepened to 43 feet. There is constant evolution and push for economies of scale in transport systems. There's no getting around that, and it's going to continue regardless of what happens at the channel depth here in the Columbia River system, or for that matter, in fact, in the context of all other ports and harbors around the world. This is not a unique problem here. There are draft constraints and limitations in ports found around the world where these vessels are operating. And the ship owners and the vessel operators make their decisions in terms of vessel purchasing and the fleet deployment based in part on those constraints of what they would see for their vessels. But sometimes they also make operational decisions where they would accept a situation where they would have draft constraints that they would know with certainty that they could not use the full capacity of a vessel on an individual port call. And I don't want to get too much into the details of vessel rotation patterns, but vessel operators are typically planning to serve big, large national markets such as the U.S. through several port calls of the same ship on the same voyage. So, for example, it may be inbound to the U.S. across the Pacific first into L.A. Long Beach, at which time they discharge a significant amount of cargo, and then the the sailing draft of that vessel actually is less after they've discharged that cargo. And the question is then, what ports do they call next before they head back across the ocean? And it may be that on what some of us in the business call the mid-port of call, that the vessel is actually shallower, and yet they still are picking up cargo and discharging cargo here at a more shallow draft. And it may still be efficient and economically attractive for them to call a port with a shallower channel, with a vessel that actually, if it were fully loaded, would draw more than that depth. And those operating patterns shift all the time, as we've seen with Hanjin pulling in and out of this market, just as one example. And vessel operators are always trying to get an advantage on their competitors and to listen to their carriers and to enter into negotiations in terms of guaranteed volumes. And they make those decisions on an annual or even higher frequency cycle than that. In our subscription business, we deal with the carriers all the time, and they're making the decisions on that kind of a frequency, so that they work within the constraints of the system, and yet they're always pushing for infrastructure that will allow them to take advantage of economies of scale wherever they can get it. And certainly that question for Portland will be, will it make sense economically in the future to have channel depth beyond 43 foot? In the concept and the methodology of the way the Corps of Engineers does their analysis of channel deepening, they usually look at 1 foot increments of deepening. And I'm sure that it's possible that in the future further studies could be done to look at the costs and benefits of channels deeper than 43 feet. I don't know the timing of those, and I don't know obviously what the results would be, but there's no question that will be an issue that will have to be addressed.
Ray Polani, a City Club member. Mr. Beeman, you mentioned 3 points as being very important: Panama Canal, European travel, and watch the rail. I would suggest that there is another point that must be considered, and that's watch the ships, watch the steamship companies. It seems to me that one of the reasons why the shipping companies are moving to the Puget Sound and to Long Beach and Oakland is the quick turnaround time. Obviously, to a steamship company, if the vessel doesn't have to spend 2 days additionally going up and down the river to serve Portland, that's a tremendous advantage. And I think perhaps it's time to consider seriously a port in Astoria, which would then allow the quick turnaround for the steamship companies, which would mean a lot of money for them.
Would you like
obviously,
to
your comments. Yes.
Oh, okay. You know, Ray, I've seen you sitting over there, and I'm thinking, how am I going to ask that water transit question that Ray's going to ask? Two responses. First of all, yes, the day's trip up and back is a constraint, although it may surprise everyone to know that in terms of distance from the actual Pacific Ocean boundary, we are a little closer to the Pacific Ocean than is the Port of Seattle. It's just that they have a faster route through the Straits of Juan Fuca to get there, but you have to go a little slower coming up to Columbia, but the distance is really very much the same. In terms of the Port of Astoria, I guess I've spoken out on this issue so many times, including letters to the editor. I guess I can say that in terms of getting in arguments with people who buy ink by the barrel, I have been featured in a full page with my colleague David Bragdon sitting over there. We were the subject of a full-page editorial in the Astoria paper saying that it was the two of us that was keeping Astoria off the map as a major league port. Flattery, yes, I guess so. The problem is there's no rail service, there's no cargo going there, and if you have containers in Portland that you want to get on the ocean, not through Portland, you go to Tacoma. It's 150, less than 150 miles on I-5, straight route, two competing railroads, many competing railroad services to get your box up there. It's very simple. All the services are already there. They're already calling there. Why in the world would you ever consider a 90-mile trip down the Columbia River to a port that doesn't exist? Secondly, if that's not enough, the infrastructure requirement for a new container facility today is the smallest. 100 acres, investment of around $300 million. Oh, and by the way, the 100 acres has to be filled in the Columbia River Estuary. So, and I have said before, and I'll say it again, it just is not feasible, and it's not going to happen. There may be alternatives to Portland, but as Paul has very clearly articulated, it's north of here at Seattle and Tacoma.